In a land where every soul thirsted, he saved the last cup of water for a stranger. They called him Mute, a shadow of a man who'd outlasted both sand and silence. But one day he gave water to a stranger. No one guessed that from that single cup, a land long paralyzed by fear would begin to stir again. Not by gunfire, but by the simple act of staying. The first light of day slid across the distant ridge, not bright, not golden, just enough to cut a thin blade of silver through the dust-covered earth. In the dry chill of the New Mexico high plains, everything seemed to be holding on to the last warmth left over from the night. No birds sang, no grass stirred, even the wind skimmed by, as if careful not to disturb whatever human presence still lingered. Tobias Ellard's homestead sat tucked inside a hollow of silence, where the weeds weren't tall enough to cast shade, and the sky stretched too wide for any man to need it that vast. The weathered wood walls stood upright like the spine of an old man who had long since stopped resisting gravity. The front door creaked, not because someone had opened it, but because the hinges had worn to memory. Inside, a hand-built wooden table rested at the center of a narrow kitchen. Only 2 chairs. One sat empty, catching the slant of the morning sun. The other leaned crooked, one leg propped up with a flat stone. Tobias took that seat, his knotted hands pouring hot water from a rusted iron kettle. The steam rose slow and steady, like the breathing of a machine long past its prime. He poured 2 cups, just as he had every morning for the past 12 years. Unchanged, unquestioned. There was no real reason. Tobias didn't think much on it, maybe because his hands remembered the motion better than his mind did, or maybe the last thing he could still command was the right to do something exactly the same. The second cup remained untouched. The coffee steamed, then cooled, just like every day. He didn't look at it, didn't have to. Outside, the clatter of hooves echoed soft against the hardened dirt. The roof groaned as the wind passed over it, and the floor beneath Tobias creaked when he leaned just slightly to one side. These sounds were the only proof he had that he was still alive. He couldn't recall the last time he spoke to someone. Even the delivery boy from town had stopped coming. They left supplies by the fence. As for money, he hung a tin can on the cactus. People took what they wanted. He didn't count, didn't care. Sometimes he stood on the porch for hours, hand resting on the rail, eyes fixed on a place where there was nothing but the scorched red of desert soil and a horizon smudged like a watercolor washed in the rain. He wasn't waiting, wasn't expecting. He didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't curse. He simply lived, like driftwood in a dried-up creek, not sinking but not going anywhere either. Until one morning, he reached for the untouched cup, meaning only to wash it like always, then stopped. Its base was warm, not hot, but warm. Tobias froze, set the cup back down, looked closer. The steam was gone, but that warmth hadn't come from the wood. He checked the stove. The coals were cold. No one had come in, and then he remembered something so small it hadn't seemed worth remembering. The night before, waking from a cough, he thought he'd heard the groan of a chair, the one across the table, and a soft clink like a lip brushing porcelain. But he'd told himself it was just a dream, just a dream. Tobias exhaled, rose to his feet. His eyes didn't redden, his voice didn't shake, but as he stepped through the doorway, his hand faltered just slightly, like someone had laid a hand on his shoulder, and he'd forgotten he even had one. The morning had arrived, soft, not bright, and for the first time in years, Tobias Ellard didn't pour coffee for the empty chair. He made a full pot, and wondered if someone showed up today, whether he'd invite them in to sit there. There was no answer yet, but the coffee was hot, and the door was unlocked. Tobias Ellard had once walked like a man who still believed in forward motion. His steps firm, his shoulders upright like a tent pole braced against prairie wind. Now his stride was heavy, and his back had curled over the years like the sagging roof of his wooden shack, bowed but not broken. There were no obvious scars on his body, but everything about him felt like something once torn and stitched back together. Not clean, not straight. On the wall of the bedroom still hung a sun-faded blue shirt, the one his son had worn the day he left the ranch to join the cavalry. A cracked leather cap rested crooked on a rusted nail. Each time Tobias passed by, he didn't touch it, didn't dust it either, as if the dust was the only thing left that proved time had truly moved on. His son's name was Jacob, killed or lost during a clash with Apache warriors somewhere south of Mogollon Pass, near the Arizona border. The military sent back a short report. No body, no letter, just one line. Did not return. His wife, Clara, waited through 3 more springs, then fell ill, then left. After that, Tobias had no one left to wait for. He stopped leaving, too. The ranch had once belonged to his father, then to him, then meant for Jacob. Now it was simply a place with just enough memory to make it hard to walk away from. Some days he'd ride in wide circles around the hill, not for work, not to look for anyone, just to see the tracks of his own horse printed over and over again, a reminder that some trace of him still lingered. Whenever someone from town came by, they'd ask, "Why do you still keep that place?" Tobias would only shrug, but if anyone truly watched him, they'd see his eyes shift toward the east room, where Jacob used to sleep. The allure was half-eaten by termites. He'd never replaced it. He wasn't ready, not to welcome Jacob back, but because he wasn't ready to close anything yet. One night, when the cold crept in faster than usual, Tobias got up to add wood to the stove. He pulled a blanket over the chair, the one across from the untouched coffee cup. In the fire's glow, he thought he saw Jacob's back, 15 years old again, hunched and whittling a long stick into a fishing rod. Jacob carved slow, careful, head down, breathing soft. Every time they had a new rod, father and son would walk out to the dry lake behind the hill, not to catch anything, just to sit together in silence. That memory, usually quiet, buried under years of dry earth in Tobias's chest, rose up that night, without warning, without sound, and his chest ached, not sharp, but enough to keep him standing there, eyes locked on the burning wood, as if the glow of coal might reveal what had been lost. The next morning Tobias didn't go to the well like usual. He walked toward the dry lake behind the hill. The sky was thick with mist. The air bit through fabric and skin, but he kept walking. When he reached the crumbling bank where they used to sit, Tobias sat down. The lake bed was dry, cracked mud and dead grass husks. He sat there a long time, didn't move, didn't think, just let the wind slip past his sleeves. And in that quiet stretch of time, the man who thought he had nothing left to wait for, nothing to believe in, nothing to hold, realized he still held something, an empty place, a lingering warmth, a habit not yet broken. He didn't call it hope, it was just this: he hadn't gone. And he didn't know yet that just days from now, someone else would come to this land too, carrying an open wound and a gaze that looked far too much like Jacob's once had. And Tobias would have to ask himself again, was there still room in him to save someone? That afternoon held nothing remarkable. Just another day among others like it, air dry, the wind heavy with dust, the sun tilting through a sky thinned by old, leather-colored clouds. Tobias sat by the trough, sharpening his axe on a wet stone, the rasping rhythm as steady as the heartbeat of the land. But something was different. The wind carried a scent that didn't belong. Not blood, not gunpowder, but a faint trace of scorched grass and oiled leather brushed with the bitter edge of burning sage, the kind Apache burned in prayers for peace. Tobias stood, eyes turned toward the base of the hill, where the cactus leaned low under the weight of the sun. He saw a vulture, then another, both motionless, like they were guarding a secret buried beneath the red dust. Tobias buckled his knife, took his rifle, not from fear, but because this land had taught him that being unprepared was an open invitation to misfortune. He moved slowly toward the well, boots crunching over charred weeds. Near the horse pen, he spotted a dark streak cutting through the earth. Broken, uneven, he knelt, touched it, blood, still warm, human. The pulse in Tobias's ears kicked up, but his face remained still. He followed the trail behind the barn, where the stone wall blocked the view. He raised the rifle, slow, steady, like in the old soldier days. Then he saw her. An Apache girl, not yet 20, lay curled against the old well wall. Blood soaked her right shoulder, not gushing but steady. Her left hand clutched the well rope, too weak to lift it. Around her neck hung a strand of carved wooden beads. A circle, the Apache symbol for life and the bond with the Mother Earth. She didn't cry out, didn't move. Her eyes were open, but they didn't plead. They watched Tobias the way the long-abandoned learned to watch, without hope, but also without retreat. That gaze struck him like a stone tossed into a still pond inside his chest. In his mind, Jacob flared to life, the sun with the bright eyes looking up at him through the haze of a fever once, as if a father's presence alone could fend off death. Tobias tried to shove that memory away, but it clung to him and his hand tightened on the rifle. The girl breathed heavy, her skin pale, lips cracked, hair stuck to her cheek, matted with blood and dust. Her bare feet showed cracked nails and dried mud between the toes. A strip of cloth tied around her wrist bore a feather motif, a symbol of oath to ancestors, worn only when the Apache carried a mission greater than themselves. Tobias stood still. Inside her, a quiet war raged. Part of her wanted to rise and flee again, as she'd done for days now, hunted, carrying the truth about Morrison's death. But something deeper, older, whispered that running wasn't the way of her people. The Mother Earth had brought her here, to this man, with eyes that made no promises but didn't turn away either. She thought of her prayer the night before when she burned sage and whispered to the ancestors, "If I cannot live, let me at least die standing." Tobias stepped back, not to retreat, but to lower the rifle. He walked to the well, dropped the bucket, the rope creaked. When he hauled it up, the water sloshed, cool, clear, like winter mornings before coffee. He set the bucket beside her. She didn't reach for it, just looked. Her breath came quicker. Tobias crouched, not too close. He dipped the tin cup, brought it to her lips. Her hands trembled. She drank, water spilling down her chin. Tobias didn't wipe it, just offered another sip. Then he saw something he hadn't expected. In her eyes, beneath the crusted dust, flickered the light of someone who still believed in land, in ancestors, even after the world had turned its back. She drank a third time, her hand steadier. Tobias stood, didn't speak, didn't ask. He looked toward the house, the door still open, the curtain shifting in the wind. Inside, there was a stove, blankets, old medicine, and a chair still empty. He walked back to the cabin, left the door unlocked. If she had the strength, she could choose to follow, and for the first time in many years, the door to Tobias Elled's home was open for a reason other than the wind. The door of the cabin remained open. Wind slid through the cracks, lifting the edge of a threadbare tablecloth. The fire in the hearth had dimmed, ash drifting like the breath of someone sick for a long, long time. Tobias stepped inside without looking back, though his ears were tuned to every stir behind him. No footsteps, no creak of wood, only the silence between two souls. one who had just placed her trust on the ground, and one still unsure whether to cross the threshold. Tobias took off his coat and hung it on the hook. He rekindled the stove without hurry. His hands poured cornmeal into boiling water, stirring with practiced rhythm. Every movement felt worn smooth by time. The kitchen was small, and everything in it was old. A pot with a scorched bottom, a wooden ladle with a broken handle, a towel yellowed by the years draped over the back of a chair. He opened a cupboard, pulled out a jar of salve and a roll of clean cloth, set them on a small table near the door. The girl still hadn't come in. Tobias didn't beckon, didn't signal, didn't ask. He just left the door open and returned to his pot of bubbling porridge. Then he heard it, a soft creak of wood, not the door, but the sound of a footstep, slow, light, on dry wooden floorboards. The kind of footstep made by someone unsure whether they're allowed in, but stepping anyway because there's nothing left to lose. He didn't turn around. She stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame. One hand still held the wound at her shoulder, eyes quiet, lips dry, but her gaze no longer held the resignation of someone waiting to die. It was the look of a stranger who had seen firelight and felt for the first time in a long while that it was warm enough not to walk away. Tobias pulled out the chair across from him, not Jacob's chair, the one he used every day. He placed a bowl of porridge on the table, 1 spoon, 1 cup of water, then stepped back, gave her space. She didn't approach right away, only looked for a long time, not with suspicion, but as if relearning the meaning of kindness after too many betrayals. At last, she stepped forward, took the spoon in her left hand with effort, and ate, slowly, each motion like a quiet test. Am I really still alive? Tobias sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing the seam of his shirt. Wind from the hills filtered through the door crack, not cold, but enough to raise a shiver. When she set the spoon down, he reached out, not to touch, but to push the salve and the bandage closer. She looked, then gave a faint nod. Not gratitude, just acceptance. She slid her sleeve off, revealing the wound. The bullet had gone clean through the shoulder, not deep, but swollen and raw, edges dust-caked from the road. Tobias applied the salve gently. He didn't ask questions, just looked at the angry skin and saw something that had once been left behind, now needing to be held onto. When the bandage was done, he stood and cleared the bowl. The girl stayed seated. Her hands rested on her knees, folded but not clenched. Tobias turned his back to her, walked to the wash basin. In the cold water, he caught his reflection in the scratched enamel of the bowl, and wondered when was it exactly that he let a stranger into his home without trembling. Perhaps it was when her gaze, silent but not bitter, had drifted through the dusty sunlight and reached the thing he'd locked away too long, not because he pitied her, but because he realized maybe Jacob, if he had lived, had once known a moment just like this, wounded, hunted, disbelieved, alone. And maybe back then, if someone had left a door open. That night, Tobias boiled water, poured it into a basin. He placed an old cloth and a shirt he no longer wore beside the bed. He said nothing. But the next morning, when he rose, the basin was empty. The shirt had been worn, and the towel, neatly folded, sat square on the table. Tobias didn't smile, but his eyes lingered on the table longer than usual, and then, without thinking, he poured a second cup of coffee, not for the empty chair, but for the one now sleeping in the room he once used for cast-offs, where now the steady sound of breath whispered a truth as old as mercy. Sometimes survival begins with a gaze that asks for nothing. Night didn't rush the high plains. The sun sank behind the jagged ridge lines, leaving a thin orange seam across the sky, delicate as the edge of an old letter. Tobias lit the fire earlier than usual, not for warmth, not exactly for cooking, but for something. There were footsteps behind him, soft, uncertain, the kind made by someone not used to walking inside another man's home. Tobias didn't turn. He just opened the cupboard, took a fistful of rice, and poured it into the pot, now bubbling low on the stove. The girl stood in the doorway, shoulders still wrapped in white, her arms hanging at her sides like she was weighing whether she still had a right to be here. He said nothing. She didn't ask. Only the scent of slow-burning pine and the light tapping of a spoon against the rim of the pot filled the space. Wind slipped through the open window, making the flame waver. Tobias reached for the blanket draped across the chair and laid it around her shoulders. He did it like a man who had done this before, like a father placing a coat around a child on a cold winter morning. No skin touched, just quiet warmth offered. She flinched slightly, then stood still. When the porridge was ready, he ladled 2 bowls and set them on the table. His on the right, an old habit, hers on the left, where the lamplight fell. No salt, no meat, just white porridge, a few shreds of dried greens, and the presence of 2 people who had long forgotten how to speak. She sat, didn't look at him, didn't eat. Tobias didn't eat either. He just rested his hands beside the bowl, watching the fire throw shadows across the ceiling. Each flicker stirred memories too quiet to name and too fleeting to hold. At last, the girl dipped her spoon, a small bite, slow, like she was relearning a rhythm not driven by fear or flight. Tobias only ate after her first spoonful, not out of manners, but to be sure she intended to stay. They ate in silence, not a strained silence, not the wary quiet of strangers, just the kind that means no words are needed. Night came down like an old quilt. Outside, the wind whispered across the hilltops, a sound that once kept Tobias from sleep, but tonight felt more like breathing than warning. She rose first, bowl in hand, carried it to wash like someone used to homes where kindness was never requested, but always deserved. Tobias didn't stop her. Later he walked to the unused room, once where he'd stored scrap wood. He pushed open the creaking door, took up a broom, swept the dust. A film of web clung to the sill. He didn't clear it, just cracked the window to let the night air in. When he returned to the main room, he saw her folding the blanket he'd given earlier, placing it on the chair. Carefully, like someone who had learned how not to disturb anything. Tobias pointed to the room on the left. Didn't say a word. She looked at him. A slow look. No surprise, no gratitude. Only a pause, like she was making sure this wasn't a trap. Then she nodded, barely. The door closed behind her. Tobias remained at the kitchen table, alone. He poured more water into the kettle, set it on the fire, now lowered to a low orange breath. His eyes drifted to the window. Outside, the dark was thick, no moon, but he didn't feel cold. On the table, the second cup had been used, a faint mark of lips along the rim, and by the hearth, the towel she'd used to dry her hands was folded, neat, clean, dry, like something left behind by someone who'd once known how to live kindly but had been forgotten too long. Tobias didn't touch it, just looked. It had been a long time since this fire warmed more than one breath. A long time since he'd heard another soul stir in the side room, just enough to make the oil lamp tremble, like the flutter of a heartbeat learning to wake again. The next morning the sky held no blue, only a thin veil of ashlight that settled over everything, making the cabin feel older, heavier. Tobias rose early, as he always did, but this time he walked softer, careful not to let the floorboards wake the one still sleeping in the room beside. Outside, he washed his face with water from the well. His hands trembled slightly in the cold. When he looked up, He saw his horse, back dusted with hay, tail knotted, staring north toward the ridgeline, ears upright, eyes unblinking. The wind carried a scent, faint but familiar, smoke, not from his stove, and something else too. The smell of charred cloth, of old saddle leather gone too long without brushing, the scent of men who'd spent too many years in the saddle to remember how to knock. Tobias dropped the dipper, walked around the cabin. Behind the horse pen he found what he didn't want to find. Blood. Not much, but fresh, dark red on the gray earth, partly veiled by windblown dust, but clear enough. Small footprints, running, zigzagging along the stone wall, slipping behind the barn, disappearing into the tall grass. He knelt, pressed his fingers to the ground. Still damp, still warm. Tobias rose, scanning the distance. Empty hills, motionless grass, but the feeling inside him was the same one he'd known during patrol. When you see nothing but the back of your neck goes cold from the knowing someone is watching. He returned to the cabin. The girl was awake, sitting by the window, face turned to the hills. Her eyes were open but unfocused. The bandage on her shoulder had loosened. The shirt he'd given her hung a bit large, sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing a bruise now yellowed at the edges. Tobias stood in the doorway for a while, not entering. Then he gave a slight nod, as if to himself. She saw it, didn't speak, didn't question, only tilted her head, the kind of nod that meant agreement, without needing to define what with. Afterward, Tobias walked to the well. The rope felt heavier than usual, as if something had caught at the bottom. When he hauled it up, he saw the bucket had a fresh scrape along one side. The water was clear, but a faint red tint clung to the rim. Barely visible, but enough to knock his heartbeat off rhythm. Someone had drawn water in the night. Someone wounded. Still nearby. Not the girl. Someone else. Maybe the one looking for her. He poured the water into the basin, but didn't wash. The wind shifted again, and this time the smoke came closer. Tobias stood there a long time. The well had always been the one thing he trusted. Deep, cold, honest. But now even the well felt touched, stained, as if the land itself was warning. Something is coming. Quiet. Certain. He returned to the house, closed the door the wind often liked to nudge open, set the wooden latch. Not out of fear, out of readiness. In his hand was the old rifle, oiled but untouched since Jacob was lost. He didn't load it, not yet, just set it on the table beside the kettle beginning to boil. When the girl stepped from her room, her eyes found the gun first. She paused, only briefly, then looked to Tobias. He nodded, didn't explain. She didn't ask. Just walked to the stove, ladled water, laid another stick on the fire. No one fled. No one pleaded, but both of them knew. The peace inside that old wooden cabin had thinned to paper, and out there, something waited, something that approached not with footsteps, but with a silence louder than thunder. The afternoon crawled across the land like a long snake, bringing no light, only a heavy stillness and the scent of trampled grass. Tobias stood in the yard, one hand resting on the handle of a hoe, eyes fixed on the far edge of the horizon, where the hills tore through the sky like broken knuckles. Then he saw the dust, not wind-borne, but kicked up by hooves, thick, steady, with rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4 riders rose from the distance, like shadows clawing their way up from the earth. They weren't galloping, but their pace was certain. The kind of riders who didn't come to ask questions, but to demand answers. Tobias set the hoe aside, brushed his hands clean, and walked back into the house. He said nothing to the girl, but she already knew. From the kitchen she stood upright. Her eyes met his for a half a second. No fear, no plea, only the gaze of someone who understood. What's coming must come. Tobias gave a single nod, then stepped out onto the porch. The girl slipped into the back of the cabin, her steps silent. By the time the four riders reached the front, Tobias was standing tall, hands loose at his sides, no weapons, no posture of defense, just stillness. The leader was a weathered man, pockmarked, with sun-darkened skin. His uniform jacket hung open, belt strapped with a short-blade knife, and a civilian revolver, not military, but the kind who'd once known service. He stopped his horse 10 paces from the porch. Didn't greet, didn't introduce, just spoke, voice rough as sandstone. "You seen a redskin girl pass through here?" Tobias didn't answer right away. A soft wind tapped the hanging lantern under the eaves. Clink, clink. The man scowled. "She shot one of ours. Down at the trading post, 3 miles south, then ran." One of the men behind him shifted, the kind that doesn't take his finger off the trigger. A Winchester leaned against his leg. "Tracks lead straight toward your place. Blood, too." The man's eyes locked on Tobias. Tobias crossed his arms, voice low and steady. "I live alone. If someone came, I reckon I'd know." The man didn't believe him, didn't have to. He just needed a reason. "We've got orders. Anyone harboring her'll be treated as aiding a fugitive." The wind blew again. On the roof, Tobias's saddle strap flapped gently against the boards, the quiet kind of sound that mimics a heartbeat when standing on the edge between justice and blood. The leader nodded to one of his men. That rider veered off around the side of the cabin. Tobias didn't stop him, didn't step back either. His eyes followed, not with hatred, not with surrender, but the way a man looks at a door he knows he can't lock. The leader dismounted. His boots hit the ground with a flat final sound. "You ought to cooperate, Mr. Ellard. We don't want trouble. But if there's someone inside that house, and you're hiding, he let the warning hang. There'll be consequences." Tobias stared at him for a long moment, then spoke, calm and measured. "I've got nothing to hide." "And no one to betray." His men searched the barn, the shed, lifted hay bundles, rummaged through old trunks. They found nothing. The girl, now lying behind the thin wooden panel behind the kitchen, remained still as smoke, her breath quiet, silent as a shadow. Tobias knew exactly where she was, knew she had placed everything in his hands. The men returned, empty-handed, frustrated. The leader stood in the yard, pulled his gun, didn't raise it, just held it, the way you hold something not to use but to make sure it's seen. "Last chance, old man." Tobias didn't move, only said, "I've said all there is, the rest ain't mine to control." The man stepped back. Wind rose again, this time stronger. It lifted a scrap of cloth, blood-stained red, from the edge of the well. One of the riders bent down, picked it up. The leader narrowed his eyes, turned back toward Tobias, and now his stare had changed. No longer inquisitive, but condemning, not with words, but with the weight of a hand gripping a gun just a little tighter. The blood-stained cloth was lifted between 2 fingers, as if it were indisputable evidence. The leader stepped closer, gun still in hand, his eyes alight with a cold, quiet triumph. "And what about this?" He raised the cloth to eye level, inches from Tobias's face. "Grass doesn't bleed." Tobias didn't deny it. He didn't look at the cloth. He looked straight into the man's eyes. "I saw the blood this morning," he said. "Someone hurt?" Tobias stayed silent, then spoke, his voice rough as old firewood smoke. "Didn't see anyone." The man's brow tightened. He stepped in closer. "You live out here alone where no one's supposed to be. And now there's blood, tracks, and a fugitive last seen headed this direction." "I didn't invite anyone here," Tobias said, "and I didn't turn anyone away." A pause, long, still. The wind had gone. All that remained was the shifting of hooves, the creak of reins, and the faint knock of the back door swinging against its frame. The man narrowed his eyes. "You're choosing sides, Ellard, and choosing wrong could cost you your ranch. And your life." Tobias lifted his head, the creases around his eyes deeper than usual, but his gaze unyielding. "This ranch," he said, his words slow, like memory being drawn from the soil. "It's been here since my father breathed. Every plank I nailed myself. Every tin sheet I hammered through winter storms. I'm not afraid to lose it. What I fear—" He stopped, not because he couldn't find the words, but because he didn't need to say them. The man shifted back half a step. Tobias walked to the well, placed his hand gently on the stone rim, didn't reach for a weapon, didn't raise his voice, just said, "I've got nothing to give you. No person, no proof, no answer you came looking for." The man scanned the ranch, half-shut doors, neat stacks of split wood, a drying shirt almost crisp on the line, a small footprint etched faint in the dust. Everything pointed to someone else being there. But nothing could force this old man to speak what he had already chosen to protect. He raised the gun, not to aim, just to underline the silence, hanging thick between them. "You know what happens to those who hide criminals?" Tobias didn't answer, but his hand gripped the edge of the well, knuckles pale. "They're judged the same, accomplices, and sometimes there ain't no judgment at all." A gust of wind tore through the hollow, dust curling behind the riders in long strokes like banners. The stained cloth flared in the leader's hand, a signal without needing a word. Tobias exhaled, slow. His hand gripped the stone tighter, not to strike, but to remain standing. "Fine," the man said. He lowered the gun. "Then I'll come back, and if I catch scent of blood again, or spot a footprint, or just see that same look in your eye, I'll burn this place to the ground." He turned to mount. The other three followed. No one said goodbye, no one smiled. They left behind hoof marks deeper than needed, as if even threats had weight. Tobias stood tall, watched them ride, until the dust settled, until the sound of hooves was no more. Only then did he turn back toward the house, walked slow, closed the wooden door, slid the old latch into place. She stood by the stove. Didn't ask. He didn't explain. But as Tobias poured water into the pot, fed more wood to the flame, the look in his eyes had changed. No longer the look of a man who had simply found a stranger, but of a man who had chosen, knowing full well he could lose everything. For one reason, because he had nothing left to lose, except the last part of himself still awake, the part that a silent gaze, not long ago, had stirred back to life. After the four riders left, Tobias didn't step outside. He sat in the wooden chair beside the stove, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the space between the walls, where light from the cracked door painted a crooked line across the floor. The girl stood just where he'd left her, barefoot, her shoulder bandaged loosely, hair tied with a piece of her shirt-string. Her face was unchanged, but her breathing had gone thinner, like she was trying not to let fear betray her. Inside her, a voice whispered, "The mother has led me here, but do I deserve to stay?" Tobias rose, opened the cupboard, took out an old pouch of bullets, not to start a fight, only to be ready. Part of him still believed in what was right, but another part, older, quieter, remembered the day he learned Jacob wasn't coming back. He'd stood by the well, gripping the rope, wondering if there was something, anything he could have done to make his son stay. That ache, like a cold stone buried in his chest, never left, and it made him hesitate now, at the edge of opening his heart again. He looked toward her. She sat on the doorstep, leaning against the post, eyes toward the hills. The light of late afternoon brushed her face like charcoal on paper. No bitterness, no panic, only endurance. And a faith that the Mother Earth hadn't abandoned her. Tobias stepped closer, carrying a pot of tea freshly boiled. She didn't turn, but when he set a tin cup beside her, her hand brushed his, softly, and for the first time Tobias heard her voice, not in words but in song, so soft it was barely breath. A song of the land, an Apache hymn, wordless, rising and falling like water slipping through stone. A prayer of the Mescalero people sung to summon the ancestors to ask the earth to shelter her. The melody lifted like wild grass shifting under a footstep, then fell again, like a creek quietly winding through dusk. She sang with her hand on the wooden bead necklace around her neck. Each bead a name, a memory, a vow not to forget. Tobias stood still. He had never heard that song before. But it pulled something from inside him, a shape, a sound. Jacob, as a boy, sitting by the dry lake, carving a fishing rod, humming a tune his mother once taught him. Tobias had forgotten the melody, but now through this girl's song it returned, and it hurt, because he wondered, if Jacob were still alive, would he be standing here now, defending a stranger like she was his own? The wind stirred, took that melody and carried it through the rafters, across the wood panel walls, out into the open land, and farther, to the ears of the Mescalero, those waiting for a sign, waiting for a voice only they would understand, a signal that she lived and that she still kept her vow. When the song ended, Tobias said nothing. Neither did she. Only silence remained, not hollow, but full, like the ripples after a stone falls into water. That night, Tobias didn't lock the door. He placed the oil lamp out on the porch, a flickering light, small and unsteady, like the ceremonial flame the Apache believed could guide the ancestors. He sat by the table, cleaning his rifle, not to fight, but because he needed to know. When violence came, what would he choose? And maybe that very night, a Mescalero man, sitting on horseback a few miles off, wrapped in shadows, heard the last part of her song, and understood. She was no longer running. She had spoken, not in words, but in the melody of the Mother Earth. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to turn the path of a blood-stained evening toward something else. The morning brought no rain, but neither did it bring sun. Only a gray dome of cloud drifting low over the prairie, quiet as a fever blanket laid across a body not yet healed. Tobias woke early, swept the hearth, made coffee. The girl had been up before him, sitting near the window, pulling loose threads from the cuff of the old shirt he'd given her. Between them, words had never been needed. Small gestures did what conversation never began. The door remained open, and far off the dust began to rise. But this time it was different. Not a small group, not 4 riders. A line of dust, long, steady, wide, like time itself, tearing across the land. Tobias stepped out onto the porch, his hand instinctively shading his eyes from a sun that wasn't there. They didn't charge. They didn't shout. They came as the wind comes, a long column of riders moving without noise or pride. The horses walked 2 by 2. Their riders sat straight-backed, calm, dark leather, feathers braided into hair, woven cloth wrapped across their chests. No chants, no drums, just presence, deep and weighted like the red stone ridges crouched on the edge of the world. Tobias didn't retreat. The girl stepped beside him, not speaking but standing tall, her shoulder still bandaged but her posture no longer bowed. At the front rode an elder, white-haired, long-bearded, face carved by wind, with eyes so black they didn't pierce you, they revealed you. Whoever stood before them saw themselves more clearly. He rode a stocky gray horse, not tall but strong. Tobias didn't need to ask. He knew this was her father. No need for words, no need for proof. Just the way the others held their distance behind him was enough to say, this man carried something more than authority. They raised no spears, drew no bows, but no one watching could doubt they knew how. The whole ranch fell silent, not from fear, but because no one wanted to disturb something sacred when they stopped at the gate. Tobias stepped down from the porch. No rifle, no white flag. He simply stood there, bare, like the root of the land he called home. The girl stepped forward. She stood between Tobias and the elder. In her native tongue, slow even, she spoke. Tobias didn't understand, but he heard, not with his ears but with something else in him, like a string deep in the chest that hums before a song is sung. The old man nodded, not sharply, not weakly, then dismounted. He walked without help, didn't lean on anyone. Each step seemed to shift the earth beneath Tobias's boots, just a little. He stopped in front of Tobias, didn't extend a hand, didn't raise a voice, just looked. Long and clear, the gaze of a father, aged, facing the man whom his daughter had chosen to trust. At a time when no one else was worth trusting, wind stirred, the elder's hair moved. Tobias's shirt flared slightly, then the old man raised his hand, calloused, rough, like a tree root hardened by storms, and placed it on Tobias's shoulder. He didn't grip, didn't pat, just laid it there, like sealing something that words would only weaken. Tobias didn't move, but in his chest, his heart beat differently, slower, deeper, and for the first time in many years, not just to survive, but to belong. The riders did not enter the house. They didn't need to. Their presence alone had changed the air around the cabin. The feeling of being hunted was gone. The feeling of hiding, too. What remained was a quiet circle, not of walls, but of trust, drawn not in timber, but in belief. The old man stood in the center of the ranch yard. To his left was Tobias, unmoving like a fence post hammered into desert stone. To his right, the girl, eyes forward, hair tied back with a strip of leather knotted 3 times. Around them the riders had dismounted and formed a loose circle, not too close, not too far, a living barrier of silence and presence. The horses shifted gently, chewing at their bits, not restless, as if they too sensed that the air here carried something larger than any one life. A younger man stepped forward and handed the elder a rolled parchment, wrapped in dark leather worn at the edges. The old hands opened it, movements slow, deliberate, forged by decades, never rushed, never unsure. Then he turned to Tobias, and in his eyes there was no longer judgment, only trust, the kind that cannot be asked for, cannot be taken, only given. "We did not come to take someone back," he said in English, clear, measured, a voice that didn't need volume to strike deep like thunder rolling beneath the earth. "We came to end what others began in lies." Tobias asked no questions. He didn't need the details. He simply knew now. He stood at the center of something older, heavier, more tangled than him, and if he had doubted before, the girl's steady gaze and the silent nod of her father washed all that doubt away. She stepped forward, withdrew from her belt a small bundle wrapped in fiber string. She placed it in her father's hands. He unwrapped it. Inside, a faded page, ink smudged in places, lines cramped in a rushed hand. A letter from someone named Morrison. That name, though unspoken, seemed to hiss through the air. One of the riders turned away, covering his face. Another clenched his fists, and Tobias, for the first time in many years, felt something he couldn't name. He didn't know the full story, but he knew. This was its center, and somehow his presence, however small, had become part of a new orbit, one that might just tilt the path of something built on blood. The elder read aloud a few lines, not for spectacle, just enough for those nearby to feel its weight. Then he folded it. No debate, no proof laid out, only this. The night before he was killed, Morrison knew he was being set up. He sent this letter to the girl, not because he believed she would survive, but because he believed. He paused, then turned his eyes to Tobias, that someone would be quiet enough to listen. And then, more softly, and you listened. No applause, no chants, only wind drifting across the ranch, bringing with it the sound of fabric brushing, horses pawing at dry dirt, and then from beyond the hill, dust again. But not Apache dust. This dust came from others, the 4 riders, and 2 more. They had returned. Tobias stepped forward from the circle. The girl looked at him, not asking him to protect her, but like someone watching a man walk out of his old self and into something bigger than any man alone. The dust hadn't yet reached the cabin, but the tension arrived before it. Tobias didn't reach for his rifle. He simply stood, back straight, the same steady gaze he had when he pulled a bucket of water from the well for someone the world said didn't deserve to live. The commander rode at the front, dust on his coat, face darker than yesterday. He saw Tobias, then the old man, then the silent circle of riders, and he understood. No one had to say it. No one shouted, because here, now, truth had stepped into the open, stood between timbers and silence, and refused to lower its face. The elder raised the letter, held it at chest height. He didn't offer it, just showed it, and the commander, eyes always half-lidded, hiding, opened them wide, and Tobias saw something he hadn't expected. Fear, not of numbers, but of truth, because truth doesn't argue, it doesn't plead, it only needs to be seen. And today, here at this cabin, between an old man, a girl with little left to lose, and a man who'd grown used to moving through life like ash, truth had been seen. No one yelled, no one needed to. There were enough witnesses, and that was enough. The commander's stare lasted only seconds, but in that time Tobias felt the earth beneath him split in 2. One side, violence worn like a second skin, the other, a quiet resolve that needed no words. The man's eyes narrowed, his lips tightened, his hand drifted toward the grip of his revolver. Not because he was threatened, but because he couldn't stand losing control. From within the circle of Apache riders, the elder stepped forward. The commander hadn't spoken yet when the old man's voice cut through the tension. If you draw that weapon, I will not order anyone to stop you, but you will not stand again. His tone wasn't hard, it wasn't loud, it was simply certain. The man paused, but his eyes didn't retreat. He was calculating now, no longer right or wrong, just chance. Tobias stepped forward, alone. No gun, no armor, only bare hands, and the steadiness of someone who had nothing left to prove. He walked into the space between both sides, where the dust still hung and the ground hadn't yet chosen. The girl said something, barely a whisper, but Tobias didn't turn. He only spoke, voice low. I already lost a son to things no one would admit were real. I won't let another one die for them. The commander hadn't drawn, but behind him a younger man showed with fewer scars, quicker hands, moved. The pistol cleared leather. A shot rang out, a careless reflex born not from duty, but desperation. Tobias didn't see it, only heard the crack, felt the sting low in his left side. The world tilted just a little. He didn't fall, not right away. He stepped back, one hand to his side, warm blood soaking through the shirt. What followed unraveled like a painting torn in 2. A horse shrieked. Steel scraped from scabbards. Voices shouted, 2 languages clashing in the air. But through all of it, Tobias heard only the wind and the sound of footsteps behind him, not fleeing, reaching. The girl, She caught him with both arms. Her hair fell against his cheek. His blood soaked into her sleeve. She didn't speak. She only held him, like someone bracing against a door caving in. A bowstring twanged, a spear raised, but the elder's hand lifted, swift and high, and everything stopped. Silence returned. Tobias leaned against the girl, his breath shallow, blood leaking from the bullet wound at his ribs. It hurt, but he was not surprised. He looked up. The commander, though he hadn't fired, stood there like wet clay, his face slack. He knew what had just happened wasn't a shot. It was a line crossed. Tobias exhaled. Not with anger, not with blame, something else. Something like release. He whispered, barely audible, "She's not running anymore." The girl knelt beside him, pressing the old bandage tight against the wound, her small hands steady as the limbs of an old mesquite. The Apache pulled back, but didn't look away. The commander's men, those who had drawn, those who hadn't, stood unsure now. Unsure where to point their guns, because that shot, meant to silence the truth, had made it louder. No more doubt. They weren't here to serve justice. They had come to erase a witness. But now that witness was a man who belonged to no side. Armed with nothing more than an old rifle and a single cup of water he had once poured without question. Tobias hadn't blacked out. Pain hadn't taken him under. The girl looked into his eyes, for the first time since she arrived, and asked without words, was it worth it? Tobias didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He simply took her hand, still stained with his blood, and gave it a quiet squeeze. And in that small pressure, the old man who had lived forgotten on the edge of the world answered, "Yes, because I didn't turn away." Tobias did not rise, but he did not collapse either. The girl helped him lean against the old wooden post beside the outdoor kitchen, where rusted pans once hung, where the scent of cornbread and smoke still lingered. He sat there, blood still seeping slowly from the wound at his side. It hurt, but it no longer surprised him. He had chosen to stand in the gap, and now he bore the cost. The Apache had not left. Their circle remained, not attacking, but allowing no one closer to Tobias. A breeze passed through, coating pant legs, horsebacks, and the drying blood on Tobias's shirt with a fine layer of red dust. And then a child, no one had noticed her before, stepped quietly from among the Apache. No older than 8, dressed in soft deerskin, hair braided in twin plaits. In her hands, a small clay bowl, inside clean well water, and floating on the surface, a sprig of sage. An Apache sign of cleansing. She knelt beside Tobias, lifted the bowl with both hands, a gesture older than memory, a mescalero rite to honor those who stood in defense of the mother. Tobias looked at the child. He didn't ask her name. He simply bowed his head and drank. Not for thirst, but for the ritual. And in his chest, Jacob's face returned, the boy who once sat beside him, dreaming aloud of becoming a cavalry scout, wanting to defend this very land. Tobias had spent years blaming himself for not keeping Jacob safe, for not being strong enough to shelter him. But now, with this child and this bowl, a thought came. Maybe Jacob never asked me to protect him. Maybe he only wanted me to protect what was right. And so he drank, as if drinking for them both. The Apache saw it. They nodded, not as individuals, but as a people, a single shared gesture, recognizing him as the man who had stayed. The commander shifted in his saddle. His horse stomped once, a short, sharp sound, but he didn't move. The girl rose. She let the old bandage fall from her arm, her eyes steady. She spoke, clear, firm. "You don't have to trust us, but you know, Morrison didn't die for betrayal." The commander said nothing. She continued, "You didn't want to kill me because I was an enemy. You wanted to because I survived." The silence was heavy, like stone in the lungs. Then the old Apache stepped forward. He carried no weapon, only a braided leather cord adorned with 3 wooden beads carved in the shape of an eagle, a symbol of vision, of guardianship. In the Apache way, he placed it against Tobias's chest. No explanation, just the act. Then he spoke, slowly, clearly. "This man now belongs to our land." The commander lowered his head, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. His men, once statues of authority, lost their stance. They looked away, from Tobias, from the girl, from themselves. Silence no longer threatened. It judged. Justice didn't come from courtrooms today. It came from glances, from acts, from a long, patient refusal to back away by those long counted out. The girl turned to Tobias again. Her eyes asked, "Was it worth it?" He didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He simply reached for her hand, the hand still sticky with his blood, and gave it a quiet squeeze. And in that gentle grip, the old man who had once been forgotten on the edge of a map offered his answer. It was, "Because I didn't turn away." That morning there was no ceremony. No townsfolk came to shake Tobias's hand. No wagons rolled in bearing curious eyes. Only the scent of corn porridge drifting through the kitchen smoke, the soft thud of cattle hooves circling a broken fence, and desert sunlight slanting through the porch slats, drawing trembling strips of light across the wooden floor. Ayanna lit the fire, hands moving quick and sure, as if every desert kitchen had already known her. Tobias sat in his old chair, his arm wrapped in white cloth, eyes fixed through the window crack, where red dust curled and danced like spirits still looking for a place to rest. No one spoke of the night before. No one asked, but in every glance it was understood. Something had ended, and something else, unnamed, had begun. A young Apache boy stepped into the room, carrying a bundle of firewood in both arms. No one told him what to do, but he knew where to place the wood, how to step back without a sound, how to fill the chipped old jug with water. Tobias watched him, then looked beyond, to where the back of the house now wore a patched-on roof. 2 new beds had been added, crafted from old wood, topped with stitched-together quilts. Ayanna pinned a piece of thin cloth over the window, not to block the sun, but so the wind, when it came, would carry the clean scent of fabric, the memory of home. On the table, beneath an upside-down clay bowl, lay a small folded paper. Under the slanting light, Tobias opened it. No name, just a circle and 3 dots. The Apache mark for those who have seen and stayed. He folded it again, didn't smile, didn't weep, just slipped it into his breast pocket, where he once kept a faded photo of a son who never came home. Ayanna poured more water. He reached out, his left hand trembling, but not a drop spilled. One hand unsteady, the other sure, like life itself. She looked at him. "Do you want a new name now?" she asked. Tobias shook his head. He didn't need a new name, but he was no longer the same man. That evening, as the sun began to draw its shadow back from the scorched earth, a woman appeared in the distance, walking with a little girl in her arms. She carried nothing but a cloth bag and 2 apples. Ayanna met her at the fence. Didn't ask a thing. They sat together on the porch, hands stretched toward a small fire. The little girl took a roasted potato from Ayanna's hand, didn't speak, but ate with the hunger of someone who no longer had to fear. Tobias watched them. 3 women, a child, and a small wooden house in a place no map remembered. He gave a quiet nod. No one needed to know what name he once wore on a soldier's ledger. What mattered now was simple, that when a soul strayed through this patch of earth, there'd be a cup of water waiting, a figure on the porch, and a wordless invitation. "Stay if your legs are tired." No headstone was ever raised for Tobias. None was needed, because in that little wooden home where the wind cut sideways through the window cloth, there were still people living, who remembered him each morning as they lit the stove and each evening as they scattered water over new rows of sprouting greens. And if someone ever asked about him, they didn't speak of battles. They spoke of a cup of water, a quiet glance, and a single time when a man chose not to walk away. The end. Not a tale of grandeur, not a story to shout, but just enough. Enough for someone who thought their heart had long gone cold to learn that some things, though wordless, can still save a soul. And in that place, though no stone was carved, there was a home, a shadow on the porch, and a cup of water always waiting.